Hello, friendly neighborhood Mizzo here with some thoughts about the identity speech. So I've received a couple of questions and we just run out of class time. Otherwise, in theory, I would have tons of time to answer questions. And also across sections, I sometimes say certain things and, you know, in some spaces. And so this way I can speak to everybody. So, I think sometimes it's really challenging to think about your identity, and especially if you, one, have never had to do so before, and two, if you exist in normative spaces in the identity, right? So, like, I didn't think about my class until, gosh, mid to late 20s. Never really occurred to me. I guess I knew there were people who were, you know, more poor than I was and more rich than I was, but like I never thought about like how that impacted me. Now I have done a lot of reflecting on that, and I know that that impacts a lot of the ways that I view life. It impacts how I view money. The example, if I was doing the speech, I would talk about food, right? And that like my class impacts how I think about cooking and how I think about eating. When you hear people talk about like I ate ramen this many days in a row, like I've literally never done that, right? Like, so thinking about like how even in times in my life where I was broke, didn't have a lot of money, like I still ate differently because of how I grew up eating and budgeting and food and stuff like that, right? In one of the classes, I told the lunch ticket story, where I always thought my mom was smarter than the other moms because she bought so many lunch tickets ahead of time. This was back when we had paper lunch tickets. And like it didn't dawn on me literally until my master's program that like, oh, other families couldn't afford to do that, right? And so here I am thinking like basing intelligence on a class situation, right? As a kid. So I think one of the things, if you're struggling to think about aspects of the speech, or if you're like, I know things about myself, but I don't really see how it fits these categories, I think there's sort of two routes that you can kind of go into it. And I think you can either go to the book and look at the categories and then think about where you fit in each of those categories, because all of us have those social identities, right? Like all of us have a race, all of us have an ethnicity, all of us have an age, all of us have uh, uh, um, a gender, a sex, a sexuality, right? Like it just depends what that is, right? And whether you fall into the norm or whether you don't, right? And so I think especially if you fall into the norm on a lot of those categories, they're hidden, right? So, like, I'm white and I don't think a lot about my whiteness because the structures that I live in don't force me to think about my whiteness. Now, I think a lot about my whiteness because I'm a critical thinker and a scholar who studies gender and race and how those intersect. But I mean, like, as a young person, I didn't think a lot about that. Whereas if you are not white, I'm guessing you've had to think a lot about your race, right? Many of my friends of color have talked about how they were aware of their race very, very young, because it was different or not the norm, right? Same thing. I mean, right? There's so many categories: age, religion, gender. I think the one that, like I mentioned in class, that I think we think about so little that impacts us the most is our ability. So thinking about ability versus disability, and how our bodies and our minds in many way, in terms of health, physical health, mental health, emotional health, right? Like how that impacts us. And I mean, when I was 20, I was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. So, I mean, I really thought that that was just always who I was, like these weird quirks about me. And then finding out, like, oh no, this is a mental health issue. And this is because my chemicals are different than most people, right? Like, so thinking, I'm using myself as an example so that I think you can start to think through, right? So that's one way to do it. I think if you're struggling is to go to the book, look at the categories, figure out which category you're in and how that impacts your life. The other way to do it is to go to your life and think like, okay, this is what's important to me, or this is what I'm aware of, or this is what, I think about when I think of myself, and then see where that fits. So the one that I might do is I have always dressed weird. I have a scarf collection. I have about 165 scarves. If you've heard people talking about like their quarantine wear, my clothing hasn't changed a bit because I wear very comfortable clothes. I have like 50 some pairs of comfortable leggings. I stopped wearing jeans or real pants years ago. I don't wear traditional female undergarments. I wear tank tops instead. I'm trying to sound professional. I mean bras, right? Like stopped wearing bras years ago. Traditional bras, right? So like that was tough, right? When you're raised in a society that wants you, I mean, I got picked on a lot in middle school. I have a very clear memory of being made fun of the first week of college for what I was wearing. I was wearing these like 70s mod pants and like an old nightgown with, it was like clear, but I had like a tank top over it. It went all the way to the floor. It looked like Mama Cass from the Mamas and the Papas. Google that. And I got made fun of so much. And I thought like, oh my gosh, I thought I'd be able to wear what I want now that I left my small town, but no. And I could really talk about like how that, right? Like me finding what I'm wearing, like connects to my gender identity, right? And connects to how I present and how I was made fun of because I didn't fit and I wasn't wearing things that like I was expected to wear as a femme presenting person. Yeah. So, I mean, there's, I think if you start, so however you want to do it, right? If you want to go to the book and then track where you fall in those categories, that's one way to think of it. If you want to go to your life and track that, that's another way to think of it. If you're struggling, it's probably because you haven't had to interrogate parts of yourself before. And don't be afraid to dig into that, if you're discovering new stuff. That being said, you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to, right? So if there's something that feels hard or, is not something you want to discuss in the speech, don't do it, right? Have a good time. Talk about stuff talk about yourself. Think through yourself. This is I hope this is a fun exercise or activity. Yeah. If you have questions, just send me an email and we can maybe even set up a time to chat. Have a beautiful day. Bye.